proposals is a divisive piece of legislation. It's not only divisive, it's also arbitrary, it's spiteful and deeply cynical. It's either being devised by those who have no understanding, knowledge or experience of social housing and do not care, or it was devised by those who have understanding, knowledge and experience of social housing but who should know better. The under-occupancy rules shows all you need to know about this government. Tax cuts for the rich, a bedroom tax for the poor. The bedroom tax has been created by a mindset that believes only those who own their own homes can live in a community, and those who rent with government support, even though many are in work, are deemed to be a burden on that community and not entitled to or do not deserve a home and should be moved at the behest of others and not themselves. Mr. Speaker, what does the under-occupancy proposals or the rules mean for social housing and council tenants? If a household rents from a social landlord and is in receipt of housing benefit, and the household is deemed to have one spare bedroom, the property is seen to be under-occupied. The tenant's housing benefit is reduced by 14% for one bedroom, and for two bedrooms it's 25%. It's been estimated about 660,000 tenants will lose at an average of £728 a year from April. I will.
Jones.
With me, that would actually affect those in work. I had a constituent in my surgery a couple of Saturdays ago who had been made unemployed, had actually gone out and got a part-time job in a filling station. His wife is a local carer as well. And because they live in a three-bedroom house that they have done for 30 years, because their family have left, will actually be affected by this bedroom tax. Is that fair for striving people like that?
It's obviously not fair that it's actually hitting anybody, never mind whether they're in work or not in work, because this particular regulation is just plain wrong in my view. The reality is, if a married couple have lived in a three-bedroomed house for many years, had children who have grown up and left home, the two bedrooms are now deemed spare. The house is seen as under-occupied and their housing benefit entitlement is cut accordingly. The couple... All right.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. And isn't it the case, as it is in Sunderland, the biggest social landlord in my city, Gen 2, have actually informed people who are going to be affected by this change. And even if those people are saying, we're happy to move to a smaller premises, there simply are not the smaller premises.
Exactly, that's the point.
Is that fair?
That's actually a very good point. It's something I'm going to come on to later in my speech. So the married couple, three-bedroomed house, they've lived in it a long time. The couple will need to top up their rent from another source if they want to stay in the home. And obviously, since the family is receiving housing benefit, their source of additional income is extremely limited. Something the cynical government is fully aware of.
In my constituency, which is very young, I've got a number of families where they have two children of the same gender living in a three-bedroom property, and under the rules would only qualify for a two-bedroom property. What would his advice be, or perhaps the minister's advice be, to the family where there's a 15-year-old and a 12-year-old boy, the 15-year-old about to turn 16, but in a few months' time, and in the meantime, from April, the family will have to find that extra rent? Will it drive them into the hands of moneylenders, or has the government got a plan?
Well, I think we should wait until the Minister responds to the debate to find out exactly what they propose for this, but I don't think it's going to be very much, really. There could be, basically, this particular hypothetical family could be forced to leave the family home, because that is exactly what it is. It's a family home. It's not just a house. They will have no space for the grandchildren who will not be able to stay with the grandparents. For families forced to downsize because of the cuts in housing benefit and in need of a one-bedroom property, the National Housing Federation finds that while approximately 180,000 social tenants are under occupying two-bedroom homes, only just under 85,000 one-bedroom social homes are available. I will.
Given the level of interest in this debate today, and I completely agree with his analysis of the general impact of this, but will you also say something on the complete lack of any exemptions in this? So foster carers doing everything they can for society between placements will be hit by this. I mean, this is absolutely unconscionable. Surely this cannot be the way for the government to proceed.
Honourable friend is absolutely right. I'm going to come on to foster carers in a little while. I mean, the lack of mobility in this area between two bedrooms and one bedrooms, for example, is not a product of tenants needlessly under-occupying larger homes, but rather the logjam created by a national shortage of affordable homes, in particular two and one bedroom properties. Oh well.
Ambeg.
Last week, who are the largest providers of social housing anywhere in the UK, and they reckon that the shortfall they're going to face could mean that 700 houses they would have been building each year will now not be built. So rather than helping the situation of housing shortage, it's making things worse.
Well, that's another good point, which is, and it's something I'm going to come on, which is it's actually affecting my own local social housing providers in County Durham. The DWP, I understand, has recognised the lack of smaller properties available. In its impact assessment, it notes that there is a mismatch between household size and the availability of suitable homes in the social sector for under-occupying claimants to downsize. And I want to go on now to how this is actually going to affect County Durham, and it's particularly my constituents in Setchfield. But before I do that, I'll take an intervention for the honourable.
Congratulate him on securing this very important debate. In North Lincolnshire, the North Lincolnshire Homes, a social housing provider, has 1,500 people who are deemed under-occupied, and only 40 single-bedroom properties come available a year. There are people in huge distress coming to see us about this matter, and it's very distressful.
I mean, it is very distressful, and the points he's raised again about the lack of one-bedroom properties, I think is going to be starkly made out in the part that I'm going to talk about now. Live-in, which used to be called Setchfield Borough Homes, is about 8,500 properties, of which 1,609 households will be affected by the bedroom tax. 1,365 are under-occupied by one bedroom, and the remainder occupied by two bedrooms. Live-in only has 204 available one-bedroom properties. East Durham Homes, another housing association which covers the communities of Wingate, Wheatley, Thornley and Deaf Hill in my constituency, have said it would take 7 years for them to rehouse all tenants affected by the bedroom tax. For live-in, the period would be much longer. Both East Durham Homes and Live-in estimate the bedroom tax would mean that the 2,977 of their households affected would have to find almost £1.8 million from somewhere else to go towards paying the rent on their existing home, or go into arrears or move out. But there are not enough one-bedroom properties.
My neighbouring constituency is similarly affected, and there's another housing association in my constituency, Dale and Valley Homes, and there are a further 875 people affected in this way. And some of these individuals are being pushed to live on as little as £23 a week. Doesn't my honourable friend think this is utterly disgraceful?
In the beginning of the 21st century, it obviously is, and Bishop Auckland, the constituency my honourable friend represents, shares some of these statistics with Live-in because they cover both our constituencies. And Live-in have said because of this, they're concerned that the level of rent arrears could increase from 4% and double to 8% in the future. In a briefing note prepared by Live-in, the Housing Association has said rent arrears will increase, affecting cash flow, which could mean that the loan facility made available to Live-in for improvements and developments of the housing stock may be required to fund administration. This could only be considered as a temporary position, and Live-in would need to readjust its spending to avoid borrowing for ongoing day-to-day costs. I said earlier that the impact of these new rules will be arbitrary on families and communities. Here are a couple of examples. The DWP's Equality Impact Assessment shows that 66% of claimants who will be affected by the bedroom tax are disabled, although recipients of disability living allowance are exempt from the overall benefit cap. The DWP has chosen not to exempt them from the bedroom tax.
For mentioning this particular point about disabled people, and he will be aware that ministers have made much of access to discretionary housing payments for disabled people, and indeed implied that the money has been allocated specifically to meet their needs. But of course it's temporary, of course it's limited, and of course local authorities' discretion to pay only to disabled people cannot be fettered. Isn't it totally misleading to imply that discretionary housing payments are going to in any way compensate for what is being lost?
Yeah. Absolutely right. Again, it's something I'm going to come on to in my speech. It would seem that a lot of honourable members have read my speech before I decided to make it, but I think the Minister will probably say that that budget's actually been increased, but at the same time it isn't ring-fenced either. Then there is the man who came into my constituency office. He's divorced his children and cares for them part of the week. He receives housing benefit and lives in a 2-bedroomed house. However, the children's mother is deemed to be the main carer, so he is to have his housing benefit docked by 14%. He will need to move into a 1-bedroom property if he can find one, but if he doesn't do that, his main problem is, and he moves into a 1-bedroom house, how is he going to look after his children for part of the week?
Exactly.
This,
the party of the family.
My honourable friend for giving way, and by the way, isn't it extraordinary there's no Conservative members here to defend this policy apart from the Parliamentary Private Secretary? But anyway, in my constituency, a couple came to my office. They live in a specially adapted bungalow. The wife has to have morphine through the evening, so the husband has to sleep in another room. Under these proposals, they are going to have to move out of that specially adapted bungalow, all because some politicians want to say they're getting tough on scroungers. That is not about fairness, it's about cheap, nasty politics.
Awesome. Well, the honourable friend just makes an excellent point again, and one that I don't think anybody on this side of the House would disagree with. And I think the gentleman that I mentioned who came into my constituency is an example, just exposes the modern Conservative Party and include, in fact, the coalition. The Conservatives like to see themselves as the party of the family, but not if you're poor and you need support to keep your family together.
Exactly.
To address these issues, the government has offered additional discretionary housing payments to help people with disabilities remain in properties adapted for their needs. However, as these payments are often limited to just a few months, it is not a viable long-term solution, as it fails to give people with disabilities the assurance that their housing needs are secure. Also, the payments are made from budget-limited discretionary funds. The payment budget distributed by local authorities will come under significant pressure following major cuts to local housing allowance for private sector tenants, and local authorities may choose to prioritise those at risk of homelessness rather than social tenants with disabilities. The fostering network, the voice of foster carers throughout the country, successfully campaigned for a £5 million addition to the discretionary housing fund to compensate foster carers who may have their housing benefit cut from April. We are hearing from foster carers receiving under-occupancy letters. Some housing departments either do not know about the fund or will not be using the money for foster carers. They report 9,000 foster families are needed to meet the foster care shortfall in 2013, where there is already a recruitment crisis, and they are concerned the situation will worsen as a result to housing benefit reform. The Minister will no doubt say that the under-occupancy rules will bring the social housing sector into a line with the private sector. But Mr Bailey, these new rules are in a way retrospective and penalise people who brought up their families in a council house and may have lived there for years, and the average tenancy for social housing is about 7 years. The bedroom tax penalises the couple who have done the right thing, who over the years will have spent their own money in decorating and maintaining the property. It was not theirs to keep, but they have respect for what was theirs, their home anyway. Mr Bailey, no doubt the Minister will also say this change is required to help pay off the deficit, because they anticipate the bedroom tax will save about £450 to £500 million. That is where this government's plans are spiteful and cynical, since the only way the £500 million will be saved is if those who live in the under-occupied properties cut their standard of living still further, trying to remain in their home, do not downsize and pay the additional rent themselves. The government is trying to get the tenants to pay their own housing benefit out of money they do not have.
Jones. Areas for the British Armed Forces. Is he aware of the case raised by Honourable Friend from Middlesbrough and South and East Cleveland, of the fact the mother whose son has actually joined the Armed Forces, fight in Afghanistan is because he is not at home and she has an extra bedroom, she will be hit by this tax. Is that fair from a government that says it's standing up for our armed forces?
Well,
Phil Wilson.
It is not the way you treat your armed forces, especially when they're in active service in Afghanistan and elsewhere around the world. I think if they say they're going to try and save money, but it's going to be impossible for the great majority of you will be forced to choose between their home and a basic standard of living to actually stay in their home. So there is going to be a shortage of one-bedroom properties. If they choose to move into the private sector, rents and housing benefit claims could be higher. These changes, can I just finish this point? These changes hit right across the board. They include members of the armed forces, the disabled, the vulnerable and the sick person who needs a carer sometimes, but not always.
Meg Hilliam.
The private rented sector in my constituency, that is so much considered much higher than the social rented sector. It is not an easy option, certainly not an option for people in this circumstance to move to. And would he not agree that in my constituency, I'm sure in others too, many people do not really understand that this is going to happen from the 1st of April or when their tenancy renews? And does he not foresee a really big social problem arising because of the government's lack of ability to communicate this invidious policy?
Phil Wilson.
The honourable member makes a very valid point. I think as MPs we're going to find we're actually seeing it now, a great increase in the size of benefit casework that we have to deal with, and as we get closer to April the 1st, then it's going to get even harder. I think the under-occupancy rules are the manifestation of the government's appalling manipulation of the welfare debate, but the language is the same old narrative that we've had down the ages. To secure their own positions, the Tories have always done this. They will pit one section of the community against the other. Once it was the deserving and undeserving poor, now it's strivers versus shirkers. Mr. Speaker, this piece of legislation is unbecoming of a civilised society. It is born of ignorance and raised by prejudice. What is deserving of a civilised society is a new house building programme, decent jobs and a growing economy. Truly one nation where we are all truly in it together. This legislation is wrong and should be repealed at the earliest possible opportunity.
I intend to start the wind-ups at 3:40, and that gives us just 53 minutes or so. 11 people are on my list seeking to speak, and I intend to propose a time limit to begin with 5 minutes. I'd have to warn members that may leave some people at the end with slightly less than 5 minutes, and if there are interventions, even less still. So first I call Yvonne Fauvargue.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey, and I congratulate my honourable friend for securing this really important debate, because this policy, more than many others, will have a major impact, except perhaps direct payments, on local housing associations and social housing providers. Wigan and Lee Housing manage 22,600 properties. 68% of our tenants are on housing benefit. Of these, 4,571 are under occupying and in receipt of housing benefit at the moment. Nearly £3 million will be lost to that social housing provider in housing benefit payments. And our shortfall is in 1- and 2-bedroomed accommodation.
Absolutely.
For example, our 1-bedroom stock is 5,591. Void in 2011-12, we had 852, and demand for those properties was 2,089 people. We simply cannot rehouse people to 1-bedroom properties. And if, as predicated by the Cambridge Centre studies, 32% wish to downsize and move to the private sector, this won't offer any savings. In fact, more will be paid for a 2-bedroom property in the private sector in Wigan than is paid for a 3-bedroom in the social sector. And we actually have an oversupply of 3-bedroom properties. So the cumulative effect of the council tax changes also will be about £3.50 a week to exactly the same group of people. And 26% of the tenants, they estimate, will not be able to pay the under-occupancy charge. So if 42%, as estimated by the Cambridge study, don't pay, the ultimate sanction will be eviction. Has the Minister tested the court's view of a tenant who has requested a move, there's no availability of a property, they can't pay? What will the court's opinion be? In fact, if these people are evicted based on an average eviction cost of £6,852 per person, my local social housing provider will lose £13.1 million. That's £13.1 million that won't be spent on building houses, won't be spent on repaying debt, and won't be spent on improvements of stock for the current tenants.
Shame.
Now, Wigan have done some modelling and some assumptions on what it will happen if this under-occupancy tax goes through as planned. And in actual fact, the change will actually cost the Department of Work and Pensions £229,000 per annum. It will cost the authority, as I said, £13 million possibly in eviction costs. So there is actually no saving to the Department of Work and Pensions under this. It really is not a policy aimed to save money. And as my honourable friend mentioned, the reassurances about the discretionary housing payments will certainly not meet the shortfall. The total budget for Wigan is £456,000. That will assist with 15% of the charge only. So if the amendment proposed by Lord Best was agreed, which proposes applying the penalty if they're only under-occupying by 2 bedrooms or more, that would certainly have the effect of mitigating it somewhat in Wigan and delivering the DWP savings. In Wigan, if it allowed just 1 bedroom to be under-occupied, it would allow the savings to the DWP of £371,000, reduce the number of affected tenants to about 1,000, reduce the potential bad debt to £249,000, and the eviction cost proposed to £3 million. Now, it's not a great policy, but it would pass the central savings to the local budgets, but it would be more manageable in areas like Wigan. So what modelling has been made in areas like Wigan of this amendment and the increased savings to the DWP? Has all the modelling been London-centric? And would the Minister not consider looking at areas like Wigan and other areas in the north and northwest where there is a shortage of smaller housing, and at least mitigate the effect on communities and tenants on this? The under-occupation tax is trying to solve a problem that simply does not exist in my area and areas like that. And in doing so, it's creating a massive problems for the individuals, for the social landlords, and for communities.
Spot on. Oh, well done. Brilliant.
Liza Nandy.
To find nearly £50,000 a week in extra rent. I am clear that the vast majority of them will not be able to do that. So they will have to downsize, but as we've just heard, we have a problem. We don't have 1 and 2 bedroom properties available. The demand for them already far outstrips the demand for other properties. So to give you an example, there are 62 households waiting for 4-bedroom homes. At present, 2,000 waiting for 1-bedroom flats. So put quite simply, there is no option to downsize. So tenants will be forced into the private sector, where rents are between £20 and £40 higher a month. If only half of tenants make that move and claim the local housing allowance, the Department for Work and Pensions will not save 1 single penny. But those families will have had their lives disrupted, leaving the homes they've grown up in, children forced to move schools, and childhoods destroyed. I have very little doubt that ministers are aware that this is going to be the implication of this policy. I wrote last year to the former minister to ask whether people like my constituent, whose mother recently died from cancer, leaving him under-occupied, and who is now suffering from terminal cancer himself, would be expected to move in April. The minister would not give me a commitment that he would not have to move.
This is a man who has up to 2 years to live. This is honestly, in the words of my honourable friend, one of the most spiteful and one of the most callous policies that I have ever seen enacted by a government. It's not even clear that in Wigan people will find homes in the private sector. 75% of the stock in Wigan is larger properties, and it will take 33 years on current building rates before private and social housing collectively can meet current needs. It's not clear, but as my honourable friend said, those people may well have grounds, if they simply cannot afford to live in their current property, for rehousing as unintentionally homeless. So can the Minister tell me where he expects a housing authority like mine, without access to smaller properties, to put those people, and how on earth he believes creating this unnecessary, callous, revolving door of homelessness and destroying people's lives in the process can possibly be a moral policy to pursue. Finally, Mr Bailey, I would like to raise a specific point that my honourable friend alluded to about foster children. It is, in my view, absolutely scandalous and a damning indictment of this government's lack of commitment to the most vulnerable children that it appears that no thought at all was given to the situation of foster children when this policy was devised. They simply do not count. They are invisible for the purposes of this policy and for the purposes of a spare room. The money that has since been made available through a discretionary fund, as my honourable friend said, is not widely known about amongst foster carers or even local authorities. And furthermore, this pot amounts to just £100 per child, woefully inadequate for the current number of foster children in the system, let alone that the many more that his colleagues in the Department for Education are rightly seeking to place. We have a huge shortage of foster carers in this country, and it must be urgently rectified for children who are waiting in the care system. Where is the thought being given to those children? Where is the commitment from their government? So can he tell me why they overlook these children in the first place, why these children simply don't count? Why so little money has been made available? Why, despite concerns raised by the Honourable Member for Crewe and Nantwich, that this policy has not been reversed? Why that money was not even ring-fenced for these children? So it may not even be used to help the situation for these children. And will he commit today that these appalling regulations, if he won't reverse them, will at least be amended so that they do not make the situation worse for some of the most disadvantaged children in this country?
Rosie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr Bailey. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today. I also congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Sedgefield, on securing the debate. And the debate will give members an opportunity to highlight the abject failure and the inherent contradictions that lie at the heart of the government's housing benefit reforms. Lord Freud, in response to honourable members' letters, suggests that the reforms are aimed at encouraging mobility within the social rented sector, strengthening work incentives and making better use of social housing. My response is very clear. It doesn't, it won't, and it can't. I intend to highlight through my constituents' cases how the policy is nothing more than a crude and naked attempt to place an even greater burden on some of the most vulnerable people in our communities by slashing budgets. And I get the sense, in an abstract idea, reducing the welfare bill by cutting housing benefits to these supposed scroungers living in houses far bigger than they need is a policy that would press all the government's PR buttons. The problem is we're not talking about abstractions, we're talking about families, people's homes, and forcing choices on them, which may mean them choosing between food or heating and paying the rent. I've got 103 families affected by this. And I want quickly to race through three. One, I have a constituent who the council accepts is unintentionally homeless. She's a 5-year-old child, is pregnant and in receipt of job seekers allowance. And I'm sure she could be a perfect example of the type of person this government is seeking to characterise, stigmatise and castigate. Yet when the local authority comes back with an offer of a 4-bedroom property, they come back with an offer of a 4-bedroom property, which means that she will have a housing benefit reduced by 25%. This constituent and young family go from being homeless to now facing extra financial burdens. In the long term, it means increasing her debt, possible eviction by the very people who gave her the house because she can't pay the 25% contribution, by being given a property that's too big in the first place. West Lancashire Borough Council, as the housing body, through its allocation policy, is complicit in the inappropriate letting of policies, an allocations policy that perpetuates the exact problem that government claims it intends to solve with reforming housing benefit. If I'm being kind, I could suggest that this highlights the fact that social landlords and councils do not have the range of housing stock to meet the challenges the government's setting. People are making short-term decisions to put a roof over their heads and neglecting the long-term consequences of under-occupancy. Why is my constituent left with the consequences of a decision which will be forced on her? I've got a second example, a disabled man living in a two-bedroom, what was a three-bedroom property. The property has been adapted. His daughter lives in the armed forces, so he's technically got two bedrooms empty. When she comes home, there's nowhere for him to go. If he moves to a smaller flat, which isn't available, by the way, the council will have to pay for the adaptations to be done in the new flat whilst removing them from the original flat to make them available for reletting. I've also got a case which relates to a constituency who's separated, has his children on alternate weekends and midweek. Again, a government who defends families, who says it actually puts families at the core of what they're doing. This policy doesn't show that at all. To quote the impact assessment of February 2012, savings in housing benefit expenditure will only be realised in full if social tenants do not seek to move from the homes they are under-occupying. So actually, rather than wanting people to move, it seems to me that ideally the government would prefer them to stay where they are, pay the increased costs even if they don't have the money. This policy is absolutely unfair, and it's been shown by the contributions that have been made so far. The government is abjectly failing to offer people the opportunities in terms of the range of accommodation or the means in the terms of jobs that would enable them to alter their situation. This isn't what I call fair when the government places greater burdens on the most vulnerable. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Simon Danchuk.
Thank you, Mr. And can I thank my honourable friend for Sedgefield for generating this very important debate on what is a very critical issue. I want to talk about two particular families that came to see me in Rochdale, but they're just two examples of many more that have been to see me. And I want to speak briefly about the impact on community cohesion and also on the role of housing providers. Let me start with Mr. Berry and his family, who came to see me relatively recently. After a serious accident 17 years ago, that family had no choice but to take a council home that was offered to them. Since then, they've brought up their two children there, both a boy and a girl, in a three-bedroom property. They've made modifications. They've made that house into their home. They are very much part of the local community. But because of the government's policy and this bedroom tax, they are going to have to move out of it. After 17 years, the family are being pulled out of the community in which they have lived for so long. And this leads to the first important point that I want to make. Families who've lived on estates, on council estates, in places like Rochdale for decades are being forced to move. In towns like Rochdale, there's people's homes that are being taken away, and they will be filled by Asian or Afro-Caribbean families because that's the nature of the demographics in places like Rochdale. And the reality is that this will have a direct impact in terms of community cohesion, and it should not be underestimated. And it will create community tensions, and there is the potential for possible conflict. And the point I'm making as well is that the government's impact assessment in relation to this policy has took no account whatsoever in terms of community cohesion. It is as though this particular policy has not been thought through. Let me turn to the second family that came to see me just before Christmas. The husband is a paraplegic. They've lived in their property for 15 years. the council have spent £18,500 adapting that property. It has 3 bedrooms. One of the bedrooms is used for the purposes of a lift, and the other 2 bedrooms are used by each of the individuals within the home. They've been visited by Rochdale Borough-wide Housing, and they've been told that they will have to pay £22 a week extra, or they will have to move out. That family describe it to me as the last straw. They've been through so much in their lives. The lady was crying in my surgery on the eve of Christmas because of this government's policy. Let me explain to you, and as I explained to them, that there is the possibility of the temporary discretionary housing payments, but that just isn't enough. The government do not seem to understand the misery that they are creating. The government are having housing providers like RBH running around implementing their policy, which is having a devastating effect on both families and on communities. And this leads to the second point I want to make. Housing providers like RBH have an excellent track record at managing their stock. Mixed communities, they focus on creating a balance. They take into account people's individual needs, and they constantly review under-occupancy and act upon it. The government should leave housing providers to manage their stock. It's not for government to micromanage. So let me finish by making these 2 important points. I put it on the record that there is a potential for community conflict because of this policy. And finally, if this is such a good government policy, why isn't there a single Conservative or Liberal Democrat backbench MP here to defend it?
Here, here.
Early Whiteford.
I begin by congratulating the Honourable Member for Sedgwick on bringing such an important issue to us today, an issue that's going to have huge unintended consequences and unpredictable consequences for at least 80,000 people in Scotland, some of whom are among the most economically impoverished people in our community at the present time. The problem with the way in which the government sought to frame the debate around changes to the occupancy rules is the failure to acknowledge that it takes place against a backdrop of changing population demographics and underlying problems in the supply of affordable housing. It's also being implemented against a backdrop of a labour market where job seekers far outnumber vacancies, and increasing numbers of jobs are seasonal, temporary or based on 0 hours contracts. It seems to me that all this talk about subsidised spare bedrooms is yet another attempt to vilify people in low incomes in a vain attempt to justify them having to pay the price for the financial crisis and double-dip recession. To debate this issue properly, we need to acknowledge that there is a fundamental mismatch between the nature of the social housing stock available and the needs of tenants and prospective tenants. Most of our social housing stock was built at a time when families were much larger and the population was less mobile. Across Scotland, around 44% of social tenants require a 1-bedroom home, but only 24% of the homes available are that size. In other words, many tenants have no choice but to live in a home that's larger than their needs. There are an estimated 69,000 tenants in Scotland who can't currently be accommodated in a suitably sized house in the social rented sector. In Aberdeenshire, my own patch, where we've got a growing population and a very depleted stock of public sector housing, there's a chronic shortage of affordable property to rent. There are over 7,000 people on the waiting list. Many of them don't have much prospect of getting an offer of a house anytime soon. Although Aberdeenshire has a much higher percentage of 1-bedroom properties than most local authorities, it still doesn't meet demand. People desperate for a house will take any house that's offered, whether or not it's the appropriate size. However, the main issue I want to talk about today is the unintended consequences of the bedroom tax on individuals and social landlords and the wider economy. It's hard to predict how tenants in receipt of housing benefit will respond to these cuts, bearing in mind that for most of them, the real terms cuts in working age benefits will also be putting their finances under considerable strain. We can probably assume that some of those who can move will move. Some may seek to absorb the cuts in their existing finances. Some may take out loans to cover the gap between their rent and their income. That's a very risky short-term strategy. It's highly unlikely that housing association tenants will mitigate the impact by taking in lodgers, because many of them are explicitly prevented from doing so because of the terms of their tenancy agreements. I think we have to face the fact that some tenants will fall into arrears.
When we consider the bedroom tax in tandem with the move away from direct payments to landlords and other benefit cuts, we've got a recipe for significant problems with rent arrears and a possible rise in evictions, both in the social and private rented sectors. Housing associations fear that financial instability and cash flow problems could affect their credit ratings. I echo the point made by the Chair of the Work and Pensions Select Committee earlier in the debate. Social landlords need to be able to borrow in order to invest in new properties and maintain their existing properties. If lenders start to see them as higher risk, their borrowing costs will rise, and that will inevitably put inflationary pressures on the rents of existing tenants and thwart investment that's so badly needed. The bedroom tax threatens to undermine the progress that's been made in Scotland over recent years in bringing about new affordable social housing to deal with rising demand. Mr Bailey, the bedroom tax is a mean and miserable measure that will cause real financial hardship to people on low incomes. It will drive people into rent arrears and into debts they will struggle to repay. And it will drive people from their homes and uproot them from their communities. Too many of the people affected by this measure are people moving in and out of low-paid, insecure, temporary, short-term work. With this bedroom tax, they not only have no job security, they're losing the stability of their housing as well. Coming hard on the heels of real-term cuts in financial support for low-income households, it'll exacerbate our existing economic malaise by taking money out of the very local communities that most need it, and it'll make it more difficult for non-governmental actors to invest in quality, affordable housing. I would urge ministers to think again and look at the empty benches here of people prepared to defend this policy. If ministers are devoid of empathy, then I'd encourage them to take a hard-headed look at the unintended economic impact of the bedroom tax and consider the quite unacceptable social costs.
And coffee.
Chairman, it's a pleasure to serve under you, and can I congratulate my honourable friend for Sedgefield for this very important and very well supported debate. I quite understand that at a time of housing shortage is important, particularly in Stockport, which has more than 7,000 people on the social housing waiting list, to ensure that people have the appropriate housing and that issues of under-occupancy have to be addressed. My problem with this particular policy is the way it's being implemented and the lack of flexibility at a local level for those families and individuals who, through no fault of their own, are going to be disproportionately affected. It is always a problem with blanket policy changes because no central edict can take account of the varying individual circumstances that people find themselves in, and inevitably that will result in some individuals being placed in desperate circumstances. And I'm only going to give one example. I have a constituent who is currently living in a two-bedroom flat and who is in receipt of housing benefit. He is under Manchester Royal Renal Team and is about to start dialysis at home while awaiting a kidney transplant. He needs the extra room for the dialysis machine and for the storage of fluids. He told me, and I quote, "My concern is when this new rule comes into effect this year, I'll need to downgrade to a one-bedroom flat as the housing benefit won't pay for the extra room." I took up his case and have been told he is not exempt, but that if he had an overnight carer in his flat, then he would be exempt. I am sure the Minister will agree with me that it is very disruptive for someone who has had a long-term illness to move home and possibly area. I personally do not think that it was the government's intention in introducing this policy to have such an adverse effect on seriously ill and vulnerable individuals. However, part of the problem is the lack of flexibility given to organisations like Stockport Homes to respond in a way that gives them discretion in these very difficult cases. Stockport has 1,500 tenants affected by this rule who now need rehousing in one-bedroom flats. But we only have a turnover of 300 of one-bedroom properties a year. So where are people expected to go? The alternative is, of course, the private rented sector. But recently, there's been an increase in private rented sector repossessions in Stockport. And landlords are not keen on taking people in receipt of housing benefit. Also, we have the smallest private rented sector, private rented sector than anywhere else. This means that people are inevitably going to have to move out of the area. The other point I would make is that different areas have had different local housing policies. For example, in Stockport, families have been offered under previous housing policies a three-bedroom flat or house if they have had a boy or girl both over 5 years old.
However, this new policy means that they can only have a 3-bedroom flat if they have a boy and girl over 10, if they are in receipt of housing benefit. So this means that families currently living in 3-bedroom flats or houses in my constituency are going to be hit by this rule. Moving out will be very disruptive for children who will have to change schools. They will lose their friends and their parents will lose their family and community links. Often these are the very families that other agencies are concerned to support in a settled environment. It does not make sense to me that the policy of one department can so adversely affect the policy of another. It would therefore seem that localism and local partnerships working together to support families should mean that some flexibility is given to local social landlords about the implementation of this policy, which would mitigate some of the disruptive impact on families who, through no fault of their own, were rehoused under the then existing housing policies. I give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful.
Kate Green.
Point about the discretion available to local authorities. They will be able to use the discretionary housing payment to the extent that there is money in that pot. But what we will see, would she not agree, is a first-come, first-served approach, which means that if her constituent circumstances are presented late in the financial year, there will be no money for them to exercise that discretion at all.
My honourable friend makes a very, very important point, and that is meant to be a temporary payment. It's not going to support someone on a long-term dialysis programme. Finally, it is very difficult for Stockport Homes to let 2-bedroom flats, and this is the reason for the current under-occupancy. Now Stockport Homes are in the situation where they're going to have to advertise outside the area for tenants for these properties. It's a strange social policy that results in people having to live the area that they have had family and community links with to make way for people to come in from outside to an area where they have no community or family links. Another unintended but very serious consequence of those proposals. So my plea to the Minister is, could he look at giving social landlords some discretion so that the worst of the consequences to some vulnerable individuals and families that we all agree should not be affected to this can be mitigated?
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr Burley, and may I also congratulate my honourable friend from Sedgefield for securing this important debate. I think one of the justifications for these changes is that they will bring about a better use of currently available housing stock, and somehow bringing in these penalties for under-occupancy. Tenants will be forced to leave their homes, and I stress that it's their homes and not their houses, and release in 2-bedroom properties, and thereby alleviate overcrowding. It might get off the ground as a theory if there was evidence that such exchanges were possible and practical, but the evidence is that opposite 180,000 social tenants are allegedly under-occupying. Just under 68,000 single-bedroom properties became available last year. But we've heard from colleagues today that this would take an age to achieve. There simply aren't the properties to go around. And of course that analysis doesn't even begin to take into consideration the issue of new entrants into the market. The waiting lists are considerable. So it simply it doesn't stack up. In Middlesbrough, this is going to impact on 2,410 claimants. The reduction in benefits across the piece will be somewhere a little short of £1.5 million. And of course, in those areas of my constituency where people are already struggling and finding it hard, that additional hurdle and that burden is going to, in some cases, be the final straw. This is going to cause untold misery. I've heard from my CAB in recent times about my constituent David Holsworth, and he lives in a 3-bedroom property with his wife and severely disabled 33-year-old daughter. He's paralysed from the waist down and has continence issues. His wife's his full-time carer, and she sleeps in the spare room. And due to his disability, it's not practical for her to stay with him. They've been informed that the bedroom tax will affect him due to them having a spare room. He can't afford the cut to his benefits, and as a result, the solution that's being put to them is that he and his daughter move into a home and his wife will move into a 1-bedroom property, breaking up that family. Another example is a gentleman who lives in a 3-bedroom property He's a father of triplets. His 3 daughters all live with their mother, but during the school term, they stay with him for periods of the week. One of his daughters is autistic, and he will say that she needs her own room for specific reasons to that family. And according to the bedroom tax, he's got 2 spare rooms. And he's going to see his benefit cut by almost £30 per week. And my honourable friend and I, some weeks ago, we called at the door of a lady in Pallister Park in my constituency. That had been her family home. Her and her husband and their daughter had lived there for some 38 years. Her husband had passed away, and the daughter had moved on into her life with her husband and her family. She's been told after 38 years that she's got a spare room and she's going to have to leave. The reality is that resource, that home, is used. She is a grandma, receives those two children so that her daughter can go out to work. And now she's being told that she's going to have to leave that house, and there are no one-bedroom properties available to her, and the only option is to go miles away where she can find somewhere and totally and utterly disrupt that family unit. And that's the sort of consequence of this this terrible measure. I just want to mention the issue of anxiety, because yes, not everybody knows that this is coming, but there are a great number of people who are getting used to the idea, and they are knocking on the doors of constituency offices. They're going to see their citizens advice bureaus, and the terror and worry of living with this, thinking you're going to lose your home, is something I think a lot of people in those empty seats just don't begin to understand. So, I mean, it's interesting. Niall Cooper, the National Coordinator for Church Action on Poverty, said there is a real danger that people will be pushed into the hands of loan sharks by these housing benefits, and for some, this will push them over the edge, and we know where they're going in terms of the APRs that they may face, and this is spiralling debt, and homelessness is on the horizon for these people, and this dreadful provision should be revoked immediately, and people should come to their senses before it's too late.
Sheila Gilmore.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey, and obviously thanks to the member for Sedgefield for having this debate. We could be here, I think, for a good deal longer, as is happening increasingly with the debates that we're having on these so-called reforms. I hope the Minister, in replying, will not waste any time pretending that this is a measure to reallocate social housing. There are other ways of doing that. Building more houses would be among one of the more important ones, but there are other ways of doing that. But this is not a measure to do that, because in fact, if every local authority successfully reshuffled people into the houses, almost certainly the same proportion of people will be on housing benefit, and therefore no saving would be made. The government has a saving in its budget, so it's not about that. So I don't think we should even bother to pretend that it is. My constituent, who is in her 50s, she's living in a 2-bedroomed house, housing association house near the city centre. She's been there for 6 years. She receives a letter telling her that, oh, perhaps she could take in a lodger. The second bedroom is very much a single bedroom. It is very small. I don't know if most people who supported this ever really go into the kind of houses that are being built. The second bedroom is very small. The kitchen is off the living room, which is fine if it's a family. How does that work with an unknown, a stranger, whom you might have as a lodger? Not only are you sharing a bathroom, possibly with a younger person that you've never met before, but you're also sharing a kitchen which is off your living room. It really is not even semi-practical. And she was, I have to say, pretty outraged at the prospect. But £50 a month off her benefit is very steep. I think a lot of local authorities, however, will do their best to help people. So will housing associations. They will look at their allocations policies to see if they can make them easier, although they will only be moving the deck chairs on the Titanic, because if they manage to move some people, the majority of in our city, homeless applicants are single people who also will have to be housed in 1-bedroomed houses if they need housing benefit. So we're only juggling one group of people against the other group of people. So even if we move some of the existing tenants from those 2-bedroomed houses into 1-bedroomed houses, the people waiting for one-bedroomed houses who are homeless, who can't be moved into those two-bedroomed houses, remember, are going to be waiting even longer. And I looked at what was available in my city, not just in my constituency, but across my city this week. There are 36 one-bedroom properties advertised. All the housing associations and council, bar about 2 very small housing associations, advertised together. 36 houses, one bedroom. 10 of them are sheltered housing. You can't rehouse these people, who by definition are not eligible for sheltered housing, in those houses. So that's 10 out of the way right away. Another 11 are ground floor houses. Now, mostly those are allocated to people who have what we call gold priority, top medical priority for housing, because they are ground floor, and even if you need to put in a ramp, you can do so. Some of those people with gold priority may be people who are also affected by the bedroom tax, which might be quite convenient, but the chances are not. And should we give priority for those houses to people who don't need them, because it makes people very angry if they're waiting to get out of a 3rd or 4th floor flat for medical reasons to see an able-bodied person get put into a ground floor flat. People bend my ear about that frequently anyway if they think it's happening. So you can't prioritise the people who need to move for the bedroom tax. So that leaves 15 houses that are available for let this week. Now, a one-bedroom, 3rd floor flat attracted 110 online bids. You can also make paper bids, so that won't be the total. 110 online bids since last Friday. A one-bedroom, 1st floor flat in the city centre attracted 303 bids. Even a one-bedroom, multi-storey flat has attracted 35 bids. Now, these are active bidders. This isn't some sort of waiting list that one might say isn't particularly real. These are people, probably not yet these people affected by the bedroom tax, and the houses simply aren't available. The real reason for the spiralling housing benefit bill is not people under-occupying social housing. It is the huge expansion of the private renters sector, the high rents there, and that's what the government should be addressing to bring down the housing benefit bill.
Ian Lucas.
Thank you, Mr Bailey. And this is the 3rd debate that I've attended on this particular issue in the past 2 days, which gives some indication of the seriousness already. And the Minister who replied to one of those debates yesterday should be increasingly aware of the concern that does exist. I'm going to focus my remarks only on the occupancy provisions as they affect disabled people, because we've heard so much from other members concerning their situations. And there are 2 particular cases that I want to refer to, because I've been approached by the parents of adults with disabilities who are being profoundly affected specifically by these changes. And one of them, Mrs Rosemary Burslem, has asked me to specify the particulars of her son's case. Now, Mrs Burslem is, I think, in her 60s and has an adult child, David, with severe disabilities, and he has autism, and he needs overnight sleep-in staff as well as one-to-one staff support in the daytime, 2-to-1 support when he goes out in the community. In the view of David's mother, who's looked after him for many, many years and worked with him, it will be inappropriate for David to share a house with anyone with a learning disability, as he has very challenging behaviour. He has particular aspects of his behaviour. He takes food, cutlery and crockery out of the fridge to bedrooms on a regular basis without any apparent reason. He flushes the toilet on a very regular basis. He switches electrical items on and off, and he has obsessional behaviour of this type on a regular basis, which makes it virtually impossible for him to be sharing accommodation with anyone. He has, in addition to that, and David is in his 30s, what Mrs Burslem describes as mega tantrums. She says it's like the terrible twos tantrums, but it's 30 times worse because he is in his 30s. He's very angry, frustrated, he feels unwell. And in those circumstances, he is not someone who is able to work and live easily with other people. He then carries out work and acts for no apparent reason. And all of these together make it extremely difficult for him to be living with anyone else. The difficulty of these proposals is that it doesn't recognise or give account to particular circumstances of that time. Now, I know that there are discretionary housing payments, but the reality is that this family is coping with the uncertainty now because of this proposal. Now, I'll certainly give way.
60s. Could he just clarify whether she's above or below state pension age?
She does not live with with David, so I'm not sure that it's relevant to this particulars in this particular case. So the problem is that this is causing uncertainty to this family now, and they are not have no certainty about whether discretionary housing payments will be for an extended period or whether they will affect them on a permanent basis. I will forward the Minister full details of the case, and I don't expect a specific answer on this particular case now. I have, however, been contacted in respect of another case by adult parents, again, who actually do, in this particular case, share a house with the individual concerned, who suffers from spina bifida and hydrocephalus. There is an additional room in these people's house which is used for the storage of oxygen and other disability aids. And there's a separate room in the house that's used as a living room by the individual concerned, who has specific and very, very profound additional needs. But because of these proposals, none of those particular circumstances for these individuals, who are some of the people who we all think, and I'm sure the Minister thinks, should have our support, they have no guarantee that they're going to continue to receive our support. And the fact is that this set of proposals is a set of proposals that is creating enormous worry for people who have huge burdens in caring for people that they care profoundly about, and have contributed enormously to society by helping to look after these people for very, very many years. And we are letting them down, and we're letting them down badly. And I implore the Minister to look at the particular applications of the rules in these cases to ensure that these people can be looked after. Because when these people came to me and said to me, look into these matters, I could not believe for one moment that there wasn't discretion in the system to cover the cases that cover the individual cases like these. These are proposals which are ill-conceived, are causing enormous distress up and down the country. The government, and I'm sure the Minister, did not intend to create situations like this. He needs to look at them again. I heard the Minister's response yesterday, and he referred to the deficit in that response. But the reality is that this is a government, at the same time as it's letting these people down, has chosen to give a tax cut to the richest people in this country at the same time. Now, that's the type of choice, political choice, that we all have to make. The reality is that the Minister has supported that choice, and he needs to get his act together to change his approach and to support the people who need support, not the people who have most.
All members have been very disciplined in their speeches, so we're almost on time. It seems to me in a debate of this kind it would be a shame and wrong to cut the time for the two remaining backbenchers, so they'll each have 5 minutes, but the front benchers therefore will have 9 minutes each. I call Gemma Doyle.
Thank you, Mr Bailey. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship today, and I would also congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Sedgefield, for securing this debate. Like other honourable members over the past few months, I have been contacted by many of my own constituents who simply do not know what to do about the implications of this policy. There is not a smaller house for them to move into, and they are not going to be able to afford their rent. One of my constituents lives in a 3-bedroom house, which he needs as he looks after his children at the weekends, similar to some of the other examples we've heard. But his housing benefit is going to be cut. So if he has to move to a 1-bedroom house, does that mean that it is right that his children only get to see him if they all sleep in the living room at the weekends? Where should they do their homework? And would he even get access to see his children if he doesn't have somewhere for them to sleep if the courts were involved in making a decision? And I've also been contacted by a couple who foster up to 6 children at a time, and again, they're not exempt from this cut. Is the government's policy, honestly, to cut housing benefit for foster parents, which means they have to downsize, they can't foster children anymore? What on earth is the Minister's plans for the children who will then not be able to be placed with foster parents? Another constituent has sent me his monthly expenditure breakdown. The only thing he has left to cut is his contents insurance, and even then that's not going to make up the difference. Or what about the tenants whose house has been specially adapted for them? Councils do not have the money to adapt another tranche of houses for all the people who have an extra bedroom. Some councils are considering knocking down a whole block of flats from 2-bedroom flats into 1-bedroom flats to try and deal with this. He's nodding his head. Does he honestly think that's what councils should be spending their money on? He's not. He does. Okay, he does. We've got that on the record. I'm a bit shocked about that. I also want to raise the impact of the bedroom tax on serving members of the armed forces and their families. And my honourable friend, member for North Durham, has already alluded to this. Because if you're a prisoner, you can be away from home for up to 52 weeks and not have your housing benefit docked. But if you're a serving member of the armed forces, your housing benefit will be docked if you're away for just 13 weeks or more, I understand. It is astonishing that ministers are giving prisoners more flexibility to claim benefits than serving personnel. They are choosing prisoners over patriots. There are 96,000 members of the regular forces who do not live in service accommodation, and I want to know how many of them will be affected, because he seems to be indicating they're not going to be affected. Well, perhaps he could explain how that is, because we're aware of examples where they are going to be affected. So service families and personnel could be hit for doing their duty to their country. And reservists too will also be affected. They do not live in forces accommodation, and so surely an even higher percentage of them are going to be hit by this. And the government are trying to increase recruitment to the reserve. So how do they think the prospect of having your housing benefit cut will affect those plans? They must publish the impact of the bedroom tax and set out very clearly who is going to be affected. It is the very least they can do to clear this matter up for our forces, because either they do not realise that serving personnel and their families are going to be affected, or they think it is right that prisoners should have an exemption while those protecting our country do not. I want to briefly read a couple of lines from an email I have received from a constituent about the impact that this policy will have on him. I am 40 years old, receiving incapacity benefit, and I live alone in a 2-bedroom flat. I struggle to make ends meet as it is at the moment, and literally keep track of every penny I spend. I do not drink or smoke or go on holidays or socialise. My existence consists of hiding from the world in a cold flat. I cannot afford to use the central heating, and I read. I cannot even visit my parents because I cannot afford the £4 bus fare. Come next April, I will no longer be able to afford to live. I do not enjoy my life, but have struggled to retain it. These changes are likely to be the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back, and I am sure I'm not the only person considering this. And that's what he said. He said, I would like to know, in your opinion, what I can realistically do next year to survive. I have replied to my constituent, but I could not tell him how he can survive when the impact of this policy comes in. So I wonder if the Minister could reply and tell my constituent what he can do.
Julie Hilling.
Thank you, Mr Bailey. And let me start by congratulating my honourable friend for Sedgefield for securing this most important debate. And I, for one, am not surprised to see the benches opposite empty, because you actually can't defend the indefensible. I want to speak on behalf of the 2,400 tenants of Bolton at Home and over 4,500 tenants of Wigan and Lee Housing who will face unaffordable bills because the government's decided that the poor should pay the price of the wrongs of the rich. Because this policy really demonstrates an absolute lack of understanding about the nature of social housing and communities. Firstly, the majority of social housing in the North West is 3-bedroom, and rightly, families with 2 children have been allocated 3-bedroom houses so that each child could have their same room, but also because this is the available housing stock. And please remember that many of these families have one or both parents in work in low-paid jobs. Housing benefit is an in-work benefit. So what's going to happen now to my family with a boy and a girl, already currently nicely housed in a 3-bedroom house? Is it the expectation of the Minister that they'd move into a 2-bedroom house until one of the children reaches the age of 10?
when they then have to move into a 3-bedroom house. But what happens then when one of the children moves out? Are they then expected to move back into a 2-bedroom house? And then a 1-bedroom house when both the children move out? And this is even if all of the housing stock is available. Just imagine the monetary costs. How could people on low wages or benefits afford new carpets and curtains each time they have to move house? Or does the Minister expect them to have bare floorboards and newspaper at the windows? And what about the schooling of the children? Will they have to keep moving schools, or will the family have to find additional money for transport to school? But fundamentally, what about the community? Social housing isn't somewhere just you sleep. It's where you live, where you become part of a community that's fractured by this ridiculous, ignorant policy. And it will also have a perverse effect. Already in Bolton, 3 young men are applying for 3-bedroom family houses so that they can each claim shared room rate. Other honourable colleagues have talked about many other aspects of this policy, so I'll finish about talking about Isabel, who came to see me about the situation, her situation, and I have changed her name. Isabel lives in a 3-bedroom house and has a daughter who's just moved out into a fairly insecure relationship, but she has a 17-year-old son with Down syndrome. Isabel is a full-time carer for her son and she herself understandably suffers from stress and depression. Isabel's son, I'll call him Carl, is severely affected by Down syndrome. He has what I can best describe as autistic-like symptoms. He can't cope with change to routine or environment. He needs everything in its place and everything done in the same way at the same time every day. And indeed, while Isabel was visiting me in surgery, she had 2 phone calls to come home as quickly as possible because Carl was getting extremely agitated by her absence. Isabel's told me that Carl couldn't cope with the move. Moreover, Isabel gets support from her community. Neighbours understand Carl's behaviour and support her both physically and morally. So what's she supposed to do? She can't work, she can't move. What is the Minister's answer to that question? And please don't say she can get a discretionary housing payment. As yet, Bolton at Home doesn't know how much money it's going to get, but it already has worked out that it won't have enough money to support everybody in need. Finally, the government doesn't seem to understand that social housing is a positive choice for low-paid workers and for those people who are caring and a number of other people. It isn't something that's transient. It's the home in which you want to live your life, to bring up your children, and until you move into your bungalow or your sheltered housing. Surely the Minister can't continue with this mean, ignorant and, frankly, incompetent policy.
9.5 minutes, and I call Ian Austin.
Thank you, Mr. Bailey. And I want to start not just by congratulating, but thanking the honourable friend of the member for Sedgefield for calling this debate. And you can see from the number of people who've taken part and the brilliant, passionate and well-informed speeches that have been made, just what an important issue this is for so many of my honourable friends' constituents. Now, we agree with the government in wanting to see social housing that's less overcrowded and less under-occupied. We want to see sensible, practical welfare reform, and we agree as well that the housing benefit bill needs to be reduced. But the problem with the government's plan is that it's unlikely to ease housing supply or save money, and in fact it could actually end up costing more. And it could also mean, as so many of my honourable friends have said, that disabled people, war widows, foster carers, the families of members of the armed forces could all lose out. Some, as we've heard, could even be made homeless. But despite all these criticisms, defeats in the Lords, warnings from housing associations, local authorities, charities, experts at Shelter, Crisis and the National Housing Federation, ministers are determined to press ahead. And as a result, in a few months, around 660,000 tenants will be charged up to £20 a week for bedrooms that ministers say that they shouldn't have, or they'll be forced to move. Ministers claim that living in a council flat with a spare bedroom is, quote, a luxury the country can no longer afford. Now, I'm going to set aside the nauseating spectacle of a millionaire minister telling poor people that they're living in luxury and look instead at whether the policy will actually work. It's supposed to make under-occupiers move into smaller accommodation, but the government's own impact assessment makes clear that all the estimated savings the policy could make are based on the assumption that no one will actually move at all. Instead, all the savings come from reductions in people's benefits. This is a policy quite literally based on making some of the poorest people in Britain poorer. Exactly. And it's being implemented, as we've heard, at precisely the moment that millionaires and the super rich at getting a tax cut. Let's look at a practical example. Take, for example, someone with terminal cancer receiving employment and support allowance in the support group, which is for people who aren't expected to work again. They've got a spare bedroom in a two-bed council house because their child moved out recently. They'd be happy to move into a smaller home, but the council doesn't have one available. According to the National Housing Federation, while 180,000 social tenants in England are under-occupying two-bedroom homes, only 68,000 one-bed social homes became available for letting in 2009/10. Usually there simply won't be a one-bedroom social home for the cancer patient to move into. And more one-bedroom homes are not going to become available as a result of this policy because, after all, you can't under-occupy a one-bedroom flat. So they would, on average, lose £14 a week, which would need to be made up to their landlord from their benefit income. That's £60 a month straight out of the pocket of somebody with terminal cancer. How are they supposed to cope with that loss of income? The government suggests they work to make up the difference or take in a lodger. Well, for people with terminal cancer or the most genuinely disabled people, work's often not much of an option, and it certainly shouldn't be forced on them. Taking in a lodger simply isn't an option for many vulnerable households either. So one of three things could happen, not just to this family, but to hundreds of thousands of others too. First, they could lose income and be pushed into poverty. Second, they could move out to a smaller home in the private sector, but that means higher rent and higher housing benefit bills, and a policy that's supposed to be saving money will actually end up costing much more. Or third, they could end up in rent arrears, they could be evicted, and even end up homeless. And homelessness, let's be honest, is a real possibility. Even the community secretary, a man not known as some sort of bleeding heart liberal, even his office warned that the government's housing benefit reforms could see 40,000 people made homeless, and the policy could cost more than it saves. The government claims that discretionary housing payments will help make up the shortfall between rent and housing benefit, but both the NAO and the Child Poverty Action Group find that the funding available is likely to be woefully inadequate. Exactly. So I'd like to ask the Minister a few questions, firstly about the cost of this policy. We've heard already that the policy will only make savings if it doesn't work, and is set to push people into private rented accommodation, making supporting them all the more expensive. So can you tell us firstly why the government's estimated the cost of the policy on the basis that no one moves but loses benefit instead? Can you tell us what estimates they've made of the number of people likely to move into expensive private rented accommodation? Given the serious concerns about the cost of this policy, can you give us assurance that under-occupancy deductions will not be increased if the government is not making the savings that are expected? The government also seems to have casually accepted that as many as 40,000 people could be made homeless by this policy. What does he say to the Housing Association, who told us they expect to have to evict a third of their tenants? Exactly. How many children does he think will have to move school as a result of this policy? Has the government put any measures in place to ensure that local authorities are able to cope with the increase in the numbers of homeless people? What estimate has been made of the cost of supporting homeless people and getting them back into housing? I'd like to ask some questions as well about the people that will be forced to rely on discretionary housing payments after these changes. The government's indicated that it expects disabled people with adapted housing and foster carers to apply for the funding. Why should they face the prospect of being moved out of adapted homes on the basis of whether their local authority has enough money left in the DHP pot? Exactly. Surely that's a monumental waste when significant time and money has already been invested in their homes. Discretionary housing payments are short-term and new applications must be made every few months. So how are disabled people and foster carers supposed to plan their lives when they can't be sure they'll be able to afford their house in a few months' time? Local authorities desperately need to know how much funding they will have in order to plan their responses to these changes. So why did he tell the House at the end of October that the government still has no idea how much money will be allocated to local authorities for the next 2 years? It's also emerged that not just disabled people and carers who might be forced to rely on short-term discretionary housing payments, but soldiers too. The Telegraph recently reported, as we heard earlier, that the families of service personnel will face deductions if they keep a room for a family member away on duty. Why should brave men and women in the armed forces serving their country have no room to come home to because under-occupancy deductions has meant their families had to move? And what assessment has the government made of whether this policy contravenes Section C4 of the Armed Forces Covenant, which states that, quote, members of the armed forces community should have the same access to social housing and other housing schemes as any other citizen and not be disadvantaged in that respect by the requirement for mobility whilst in service? Can he tell us what discussions he's had with the MOD on this issue? Now, Mr Bailey, there's no dispute, as I said earlier, about wanting to tackle overcrowding and under-occupancy, or the need to get the Housing Benefit Bill under control. But as honourable members on this side of the House have shown, these plans are unlikely to ease housing supply or save money and could actually end up costing more. Worse still, they're going to put people in debt and risk making them homeless. Labour's alternative, where under-occupiers would face deductions if they'd been offered a smaller property and refused it, would have worked and would have saved money. The fundamental truth is that the best way to get the benefits bill down is not to attack the families of disabled people, soldiers or poor tenants, but to get everybody back to work. That's what Labour's job guarantee would do, which is why Britain needs reform that's tough, fair and most of all works. Thank you.
The Minister, Steve Webb.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Bailey, and can I, of course, congratulate the Honourable Member for Sedgefield on securing this debate, and it is indeed an important issue. It's the second debate this week that I've responded to on the issue, and it's good to have the opportunity to put on record the response to a number of the issues that have been raised, to deal with the myths that are growing up around service personnel. But it is worth setting this debate very briefly in context. Most of my remarks will be about the specific matter in hand, but it is almost being implied that the government woke up one morning and thought, wouldn't it be great if we could take some housing benefit off people? And it's important to understand why this is being done. Now, in the final year of the last Labour government, every time the government raised £3, it spent £4. Now, the word morality has been used very extensively in this debate, Mr Bailey. Borrowing money that you expect your children to pay back is not a progressive thing to do. Parents who go out and blow money on their credit card and say to the kids, when you grow up, you can pay it off, we would think had behaved irresponsibly. That is what we're having to deal with now. Now, under whichever party had taken control in 2010, I'm not giving away. Both parties set out deficit reduction plans which involved tens of billions of spending cuts. Given that public spending consists fundamentally of public sector pay and social security and tax credits, those are the two big areas. Public sector pay, both sides, I think, have agreed has to be held back. Benefits and tax credits would also have to be part of the mix. Within the benefits budget, where would you look? Where is the low-hanging fruit? Where's the easy things to cut? Of course, there is precious little of that. Housing benefit is a very large part of the benefits budget, has been rising fast. So the question is there an area in the housing benefit budget that would be, no, I'm not giving away, is there an area of the housing benefit budget where we can tackle some of the housing problems we have and save money? I'm quite clear, I've said I'm not giving away. This is an area of the housing benefit budget where we can do more for the housing, better management of the housing stock. And let me give a specific example of this. We know that it's been said in this debate, housing benefit not covering a spare room is immoral. That's been the tenor of what's been said. But when Labour introduced the local housing allowance, private sector tenants don't get housing benefit for a spare bedroom. Where's the morality in saying to private tenants they can't have a spare room, but social tenants who are paying subsidised rents can have a spare room? They can be living next door to each other, and we're favouring the social tenant over the private tenant. Why should housing benefit not cover spare rooms for private tenants when it does for social tenants? That is simply not fair. The second unfairness we have to tackle is overcrowding. The 250,000 households in England alone who are overcrowded have had no voice in this debate. They are trying to get family homes, they are trying to get homes that they need, they are living in overcrowded accommodation, and yet and the Honourable Lady says build some housing. I'd just like to point out that the shortage of affordable social housing didn't start in 2010. Somebody had 13 years to sort that out, and that needs to be tackled, and I agree, it needs to be tackled.
From a sedentary position. The Minister's got quite a lot of points to respond to, and he's made it clear he doesn't want to give away. Minister.
Thank you, Mr Bailey. So the second unfairness we have to tackle is the needs of people who are living in overcrowded accommodation, 250,000 of them, who we need to have a voice in this debate because all too often they don't. So we need to tackle that. People have rightly said that these homes are family homes, they're not just houses, people have lived their lives in them. I accept that, and that is why we have exempted people over state pension credit age. So someone who is essentially a pensioner is not affected by these changes at all. We're talking about people of working age. Now, how will people respond to this change? There is a range of ways people will respond. It's been mentioned that in some cases housing benefit is an in-work benefit. Now, the average loss nationally from this policy is £14 a week. So for somebody who is in work on a minimum wage, that's the equivalent of about 2.5 hours of additional work. Now, it's not quite that because of tapers and so on, but we're talking about a few hours of extra work as one option for people who are in it. Now, again, from a sedentary position, the Honourable Lady can't control herself, says, where's the work? On the day that we've published yet another set of figures showing another fall in unemployment, record growth in employment, the myth that there are no jobs available when we've got more people in employment than ever before needs to be countered. So for some people, taking a job or working extra hours is an important part of the solution. It's been mentioned that for some people, taking in a lodger or a subtenant is not an option, but for many it will be. The Honourable Member for Banff and Buchan said that this may be an issue. In general, housing associations and social landlords should allow, in an orderly manner, you can't just take somebody in and tell them after the event, should allow subtenancies. They have to have a strong reason to refuse. So the presumption is that that can be done, and that's part of the mix. I had a constituent who was a single person living in a 3-bedroom social housing accommodation, phoned me up. She'd had a letter about under-occupation, and when I spoke to her, she said, well, actually, I've got a brother and sister-in-law. Actually, they could live with me. That would be better use of the housing stock. It would meet their housing need, and it would meet the shortfall. So in those cases, that would be a better use of the housing stock, which benefits all of us. Now, I want to specifically address the issue of discretion and discretionary housing payments, because the member for Stockport, in what I thought was a thoughtful contribution, raised the issue of discretion. The member for Wrexham also raised the issue of discretion. But we're being asked to do contradictory things here. Where people have identified a group such as foster carers or people who've had major disability adaptations to their property, what we've said is rather than try and have Whitehall central government define exactly what that means in every case, we've allocated the money we think is needed to deal with the problem and given it to local authorities to respond case by case. That is the local discretion we think is right. But what we've been asked to do is give local discretion, except in every case where we've given local discretion, to have an absolute right to a discretionary housing payment or to exempt people. Now, this is the tension. There are all sorts of individuals who you might think should be exempt, but trying to sit down and write a regulation or a statutory instrument to exactly define who all these people are from Whitehall doesn't work, which is why we've allocated discretionary housing payments this year of 60 million, next year of £155 million to local authorities. I mean, to take the Durham local authority, last year they had 177,000 of DHPs. Next year it will be £880,000 of DHPs to respond to just the sorts of people that many honourable members have brought forward. Now, I want to respond to the issue about service personnel, because I think this is, I assume, based on ignorance rather than deliberate misleading. If you are, for example, let's take the case. First of all, you are a serviceman or woman who is married. Then you go away, it doesn't matter because there's still a 1-bedroom need. So married service personnel, not an issue. Service personnel living in service accommodation, not an issue because they're not social tenants on housing benefit. So we're talking about service personnel living in social rented accommodation who are, for example, adults living with their parents, that kind of thing, on housing benefits. So we're getting narrower and narrower and narrower groups. If you are a member of the armed forces on a wage, because you're living at home with mum and dad, the benefit system says, there's somebody in the house with a wage. We expect that person to pay up to £70 a week towards the rent, something called a non-dependent deduction. When the serviceman or woman goes to the front line, if they're away for a long period of time, we no longer treat them as a non-dependent in the household. So we no longer deduct the 70 quid from the housing benefit. So when a young person goes away to fight for a long period of time, the parent's housing benefit will, in general, go up. Not the story the Labour Party have been putting out today. Now, to move on to some of the detailed points that were made, Mr Bailey. We've been asked about foster carers. We think that the discretionary housing money we've made available because of this important point will assist around 5,000 foster carers. And bear in mind, this isn't like all the foster carers. This is the foster carers who might be in social rented accommodation, might be on housing benefit, might need a spare bedroom. So a subset of all the fosterers. Of course, the fostering organisations would prefer a total exemption. I accept that. But failing that, their estimate is that these are about the right numbers of people, and we've had meetings and discussions with the fostering organisations. Now, the issue was raised about children, and clearly that's an important issue. The majority of people affected by this measure don't actually have dependent children. We're generally talking about older people. But the position of families who have children is important. It was suggested that 2 teenagers of the same gender shouldn't be expected to share a bedroom. I don't follow that. I mean, having shared a bedroom with my brother till we were both 18, I don't think it did us any particular harm. And it's a time when there is a great shortage of affordable accommodation. I can't see what the problem is with older teenagers of the same gender sharing a bedroom. The important issue, Mr Bailey, has been asked about whether DHPs are temporary or permanent. There's a really important point here. DHPs in the past have been a temporary fix. You've got a short-term problem, you need a bit of DHP to bail you out, and then you move or do something about it. DHPs can be for the long term under the new system because some of these situations are not going to change. If you live in a house that's been very substantially adapted, that isn't going to change. So local authorities are getting revised guidance and will have to think about DHPs in a different way because some people do need longer-term certainty, as has entirely properly been said. The issue was raised of a size mismatch. A member for Banff and Buchan said we've got this size mismatch, and indeed we do. And then when a council is apparently doing something about it, is actually building houses that match the housing need, the Honourable Lady says, well, how can I possibly think that's a good thing? I've just got 60 seconds to go. When actually a council is doing something about building houses of the right size to match housing need, they should be applauded, not condemned for doing it. The Honourable Member for Dudley said what we really need is managing over-occupation and under-occupation and so on. But we've had decades to do something about this and nothing has happened. What we need, some local authorities and housing associations have said to us that housing associations have welcomed the opportunity to look at the housing allocations and make better use of the precious resource which is social housing. Now, there will be disruption as a result of this. I fully accept that. And that is why we have a 2-year programme looking at how all of this is working, evaluating the impact, publishing that research. If we need to make changes to the system as we go, because there are perhaps groups that we haven't thought of, impacts we haven't thought of, we'll be in a position to do that. It will be thoroughly researched, publishing the results, but at a time when we do need to save money, being fairer between people in the social sector and the private sector and tackling overcrowding as well as under-occupation is a fair way to reduce the spending deficit that we were handed by the party opposite.
I congratulate all members on the backbenches and the front benches for sticking to the time limits, which meant that everybody was able to get in. Now, we must move to the next debate.